Hello, and welcome everyone to today's webinar on the transformative role of artificial intelligence and machine learning in anti-money laundering practices. My name is Aspen Phillips, and I'm the Operations Support Manager with Global Compliance Institute, and we are thrilled to have two distinguished speakers joining us for today's session. First, I would like to introduce Faisal, CEO of ComplyTech. Faisal's career spans leadership roles across top organizations, and he brings a wealth of expertise in AML compliance and strategic regulatory solutions. Joining him is Aliyah, a seasoned practitioner in global financial crime and regulatory compliance, with over a decade of experience advising regulated institutions and fintech companies. Today, both Faisal and Aliyah will discuss how AI and ML are revolutionizing key AML processes, including transaction monitoring and name screening, enhancing the accuracy, speed, and efficiency of financial crime detection. Thank you for all being here today. And now I will pass it over to you, Faisal and Aliyah.
Thanks so much. I'm really happy to be here. We've got a lot of content. We have a lot of information. We are expecting that you are, of course, a compliance officer, a compliance specialist. We are expecting that your level of knowledge on AI and machine learning in the context of name screening and compliance is beginner to intermediate, which is perfectly fine. We love talking about this. Aliyah, it's going to be a good session, right?
It really will, Faisal, and I'm pleased to be here with you all today.
Right, so let's get started. Aliyah, you have the floor.
Yeah, I do. Thank you so much. So we all know compliance is the cornerstone for all regulated organizations. It's what helps them mitigate risks that are associated to financial crimes, but also sanctions evasion. Traditional rule-based monitoring systems and screening systems are struggling to keep pace with the evolving criminal tactics. So today, Faisal and I are going to explore on a really deep level how AI and machine learning can enhance these traditional transaction monitoring and name screening processes. These technologies bring in sophisticated algorithms that help detect unusual behaviors and also help flag potential high-risk sanctioned customers in real time. And that's really key if we think about the world we're living in, where faster payments and instant payments are becoming the norm. So we're going to have a look at some specific AI and machine learning terminologies. I'm going to hand it over to Faisal to take us through what these key terms mean, and then we'll talk about how they can practically be applied in your business.
Thank you so much, Aliyah. I appreciate that. All right, guys. So as we sort of expected, you're coming from a beginner or intermediate background on this. So we're going to go sort of word for word here. Artificial intelligence is very simply just the ability for machines to compute and really calculate very complex problems for us. They could be from data sets, they could be language, and there could now be content and images and whatnot. So really, artificial intelligence is simply a very advanced computer or very advanced computing algorithm. Now, here, a couple of more terms you're going to hear about, not just here, but in the world of AI as it is. First, you're going to hear that AI automates things. That to a certain point is true. What you can actually do is just allow it to conduct any repetitive task on an ongoing basis. You provide it specific functions, output, and it's going to do it for you. The next thing you're going to hear a lot about is NLP, natural language processing. And all that means is a machine to understand human knowledge and answer back information to you in that same language. It's pretty revolutionary because up until now, what humans had to do in order to communicate with computers is learn the language of the computer, which is what a programmer is. They learn the different languages of the systems that they're using, whether that's Python or C and whatnot. And really, the rest of the population was cut off from being able to interact with machines. Well, with natural language processing, you don't actually need any type of competency or university degree or specialization in computer engineering. Really, the only tool you need is some basic form of communication skills in English. And you can pretty much ask it to do very complex tasks for you. So that's what natural language processing is about. Machine learning is less of a deeper subset than natural language processing. Machine learning actually has existed for a very long amount of time and really is just algorithms. Now, if you want to know how far back machine learning goes, it goes as far back as for the last 10 to 20 years. So if about 10 to 15 to 20 years ago, you were on any dating application and you were swiping right or swiping left, well, if you think that you were the ones that made this choice, it's not true. It's actually complex algorithms based on machine learning that essentially made two people join together. So for the last 20 years, machines have already been deciding the next generation of humans by pairing the parents together. So machine learning has existed for a very, very long amount of time. And then you're also going to hear about cognitive computing. Now, this is a lot more complex because really what you're doing is you're simulating how a human thinks when it's about to engage in some type of activity. Let me give you an example. So those of you that have children know that you always remember when their birthdays are. So remembering when the birthdays are, when the anniversaries are, these type of things require some amount of human thought. Now, you also know that on the day of that birthday, all the things you have to do during that day, right? So it's going out, shopping for things, getting the food and the catering, picking up stuff, picking up all the glasses, the drinks, the food, and that sequence up until the party of that day. So that's the second level of human thought. And then at the time of the party, you have to juggle 10 different tasks at the same time, all the different chaotic events, and you have to manage that on an ongoing basis. Humans can do that rather easily. Machines up until now have not been able to do so. So that type of remembering the milestone, on the time of that milestone, the order of events, and at the event, managing the various chaotic tasks is what's known as order-dependent models, which is the basis of cognitive computing. And so far, there's been quite a few advancements where machines are able to learn that type of cognitive computing at the levels that humans can juggle as well. So, bunch of sort of new terms you're going to hear about, but I hope I've been able to give you a little bit of basis of those definitions. Now, if you need us to go over a couple of those, we've got a couple of Q&A boxes in there, so hit those questions and I'll be more than happy to go over those definitions again. So let's start with machine learning. That's very simple. It's essentially the ability for a machine to learn from us. There are different ways of learning. You can learn by supervised learning, which is you give it a data set, you tell it to do something, and then you correct it. That it's as simple as that. You essentially give it a data set, you tell it to do a few things, you look at the results, and you tell it whether that result is true or not. So, for example, I'll take a very simplistic example here. You give it this. Oh, you can't see it. There's the screen in front of me. But let's say you were to give it a phone and you were to give it a pen. And you tell it, this is a phone, this is a pen. And you're essentially supervising its learning. It's going to come up again and it's going to, you hold up, let's say, a keyboard and it says it's a pen. And you tell it, no, it's not a pen, it's a keyboard. That's supervised learning. That's usually done for quite a few types of money laundering transactions related to, for example, fraud. Fraud generally uses some amount of supervised learning, especially fraud that is known. Now, there are also a lot of vectors that you can't control and you can't predict. For that, you use another type of learning called unsupervised learning. And what that is you don't actually teach the machine anything. You give it all different types of data sets, and it's going to come up with some amount of anomalies or some amount of detection. And you have to sort of tell it, is that true or is that not true? That type of learning is known as unsupervised learning. Then you have reinforcement learning. That's when you add the models through the system over and over again. You add multiple different systems and you design some intelligent systems. One of my favorite systems that were built with reinforcement learning was actually creating malicious money laundering agents. And really what that is you train the agent with the different transaction types and different transaction patterns. You tell it what the controls are and what the limits are, and you actually reward it if it breaks any of the controls. And that type of learning is quite sophisticated because by learning how malicious agents work, you can then reverse create agents that detect those type of behaviors. So those are sort of the three areas and different types of learning. Algorithms are much more basic. They've existed for the longest time. They're fairly simplistic when you can build it yourself, but they just are essentially a simple set of data points saying, look, if this happens, please do this as well. So algorithms can be as basic as that. They can be as basic as, if someone has watched this video, please make sure they watch this video as well. In a money laundering sense, it will be, well, generally, a suspicious person, when they add this product in this amount, they tend to also do this type of behavior. So algorithms can be designed for those type of simplistic tasks as well. All right, a lot of key concepts, but it all is only useful if it's in practice, in actual practice. Elia, how can we use this in practice?
Well, thanks, Faisal. And I love the way you explained all the terms really clearly for our audience. It's also really interesting to note that this technology was around for the past 20 years, and essentially it's nothing really new, but the applications of it is becoming increasingly recognized, especially by regulators around the world, that are really encouraging financial institutions and other regulated industries to adopt such technologies in order to enhance their anti-money laundering controls. And that would include fraud controls and also sanction screening. For example, the Financial Action Task Force has emphasized the importance of leveraging these types of technologies in order to really streamline AML processes that can be really resource heavy for an organization, but it also improves the accuracy and the effectiveness of detection and reduces the need for manual interventions. So let's take a closer look at some of the actual practical applications for this technology. Now, starting off, we'll go through transaction monitoring. Now, AI and machine learning really enhances transaction monitoring. It takes it to another level because you have the ability to detect suspicious activities, not only just in real time, but it allows you to analyze vast volumes of data. So the larger organization you are, the more volumes of payments you're processing. AI and machine learning is really needed in order to process them in real time and in a quicker basis. So some of the ways that machine learning and AI is actually applied in transaction monitoring includes pattern recognition. This is where we're using machine learning algorithms that are trained to detect patterns that indicate potential money laundering or fraud activities. And these are trained based on known patterns or typologies. A lot of regulatory bodies have actually published reports on red flags and financial crime typologies related to predicate offenses to money laundering. So those types of indicators and typologies can really be used as part of this pattern recognition. The algorithms will analyze large data sets, which would be your payments data. It could also be your customer data. And it then identifies the typologies to trigger an alert, or it will trigger an alert where there is unusual activity that is not really based on what your customer should be doing. Not only that, but you can also then identify typologies such as unusually large transactions, frequent transfers, or even transactions that are going to higher risk jurisdictions that just don't seem right. I spoke a bit about anomaly detection there when I talked about pattern recognition, but anomaly detection is another area where machine learning models are especially useful. Particularly the unsupervised learning that Faisal touched upon earlier. So unsupervised learning can flag transactions that deviate from normal customer behavior. Now, these anomalies will then signal that potentially there's some suspicious behavior happening and alert analysts to do a deeper investigation into it. There's also the real-time monitoring aspect. So where you're using AI-powered systems, you can process transactions as they occur. And this is really important in the fraud space where you want to take immediate action to either block a transaction, or if it's suspected money laundering, you want to be able to then have investigations quickly in order to identify whether a suspicious activity report or an unusual activity report is required. Now, these applications are also really useful to reduce false positives. Now, false positives are a bane in any compliance person's life. It's something we've all experienced, especially when it comes to traditional transaction monitoring. The reason being is that traditional transaction monitoring systems are built on static rules. They're fixed thresholds. Oftentimes they're not segmented based on the type of customer you're dealing with. And what happens is that your analysts or your operations teams are then really heavily focused on discounting these false positives, as opposed to looking at those true positive alerts that might require further investigations and information from a customer. Where AI-based systems really come into use is that they can reduce that number of false positives because they're actually trained on different types of typologies and then can detect anomalous patterns. Let's move on now to name screening. Name screening and sanctions list screening is really important in order to identify individuals who are either on a watch list, where there's adverse media on the individual or the entity, or where there's the involvement of politically exposed persons or sanctioned individuals or entities that you really need to be alerted about because you wouldn't want to open an account for them. Part of that is natural language processing, and Faisal did touch upon this earlier. So natural language processing helps interpret and analyze names that can be in different languages and in different formats. This is very useful when it comes to resolving linguistic variations like nicknames, AKAs, or different naming conventions that are adopted in different countries. The more global of an organization you work in, the more there will be a need to have natural language processing in order to reduce false positives and really get to identify where there are true positive matches on a name. Part of that part of that natural language processing is also fuzzy matching. Fuzzy matching is a term I'm sure you've heard of. A lot of vendors use that term, but what it actually means is that they are techniques that are used to identify where a name has either been misspelled, shortened, or abbreviated in such a way that someone is trying to evade actually being identified through screening processes. And this really helps you identify those missed true positive alerts, because it's the missed true positives that you really don't want to be missing, especially when you think about the penalties and the liability involved when dealing with sanctioned individuals. Now, name screening can also utilize machine learning through a process called entity resolution. Now, entity resolution is where we can identify relationships between individuals or organizations, where we can link different aliases with other related entities in order to understand how individuals and entities are actually connected. This is particularly important when you think about relatives and close associates of not only sanctioned individuals, but also politically exposed persons, because identifying these relatives and close associates or other entities that could be linked to these individuals is a regulatory requirement in most jurisdictions. And finally, as well, you have your know your customer. I'll add in know your business in here as well. And then the overall customer due diligence process. AI and machine learning can really be utilized here in order to gather a lot more data, analyze a lot more customer data quicker, but it can also be used to automate certain processes that really do not require a human to do it. So where you have a lot of resources at an onboarding process, you can move and reallocate those resources to actually looking at the alerts as opposed to doing manual tasks that could be automated through the use of machine learning or AI bots, for instance. And right now, we could just kind of summarize it. So let's summarize the differences between traditional and AI-based transaction monitoring. You have your automated customer onboarding, where you can automatically collect data, verify customers, identify fraudulent individuals or any other kind of fraud markers, and really just improve that onboarding experience, because the quicker you can onboard a customer in a safe manner, the better it is for your business. Traditional is another kind of difference between traditional and AI-based systems is the use of risk scoring. So if you think about risk scoring when it comes to the traditional way of doing it, you have a risk score for your customer at the point of onboarding, which is calculated by different risk factors associated with that customer. But then it's just there. It's a static risk score. It doesn't really evolve throughout that customer journey. And this is where AI and machine learning can really be used, because what you can do is whenever there are alerts being triggered through your transaction monitoring or your screening system as part of ongoing due diligence, you can revise that initial customer risk score and have it as almost a real-time score. It also makes your processes scalable. As your business grows and expands, you want to ensure that your operational processes can scale at the same speed. You don't want to be bogged down by manual processes. Sorry, my system just froze on me. Gave me a second.
No
Technical.
worries. While you catch up,
Yeah.
I'll go over. So just summarize what Aaliyah just mentioned, guys. So on your screen, there is a really nice sort of grid that we've prepared for you, showing the splits between traditional and AI based. So Aaliyah, let us finish this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. So this graph is great because it's really splitting out the specific aspects I mentioned when it comes to the adaptability, the speed of detection, being able to handle complex schemes. So the entity resolution that allows you to identify networks and scalability in today's organizations where scaling quickly is super important. You can really see here that AI-based transaction monitoring is really the way forward. And when it comes to traditional transaction monitoring, there's a lot of false positives and you don't really have that scalability.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Aaliyah. I really appreciate that. All right, guys. So you've heard all the benefits about it. And let's say you decide, well, I want to be a buyer and I want to use sort of, machine learning models as the basis of my transaction monitoring system. And you've got something in place and let's say you come to us and we are lucky enough to be your vendor. You might have a question. Well, tell me exactly how your models actually detect suspicious transaction. Right. So we've broken it up. There are sort of like 7 different steps involved in making this work. First, you have supervised learning models that have already been trained of large amount of data, very similar to yours, either institution or complexity or customer category or geographies or a combination of all of them. And those models have already been trained to react and give output in a certain way. So we're going to come with those models. But then we also have your data, which hasn't been sort of trained, right? So what we're going to use is unsupervised models because it doesn't actually know what to find in your data itself. However, it will be able to pick up anomalies, things that should not be the way it is. It doesn't make sense in the context of the other data. So that's the second step. Third is that rather than sort of pushing the model to learn a certain way, which is known as model bias, and we don't want to do that, we're going to have a semi-supervised learning, meaning it's going to learn a little bit of your actions and sort of what is supposed to be expected, but not too much. You just want it to learn on its own with a little bit of guidance, but not give it too much direction. After all, you want it to discover new things. And if you try to overtrain it, it's actually going to learn exactly what you expect of the previous models and really not part of your data. All right, so now that's done. Now the fourth step is where we have data enrichment. So you, as a compliance officer in your institution, you get data from a bunch of different places, right? You have data from your KYC engine, from your reporting, from your FIU, maybe you've got social networks as single sign-ons. Maybe you have website trackers, fraud data, whatever it might be. You've got all these different data silos. And what you do is that you add that to your transaction. It creates amazing context. And that context allows the model to get even better. Now, it gets better and it gives you information and says, look, I think this is malicious or this is suspicious. I think this is not suspicious. Well, why don't you go ahead and then give feedback to it saying, I agree with you. I don't agree with you. Next time when you do this transaction, don't use this data. That type of feedback, this type of continuous feedback and feedback loop is super important for the models to get better and better. Now, if all this is done well, then you have, for the most part, reduced the amount of false positives because you sort of trained it to discard false positives. And that's the real goal, right? The real goal is to make sure that at the end of it, the alerts that you get are not the ones that you are going to spend and waste time on, but really the ones that you can actually do some actionable work. Because the entire purpose of why you're a compliance officer and why there's an AML program is to make sure that you come up with actionable intelligence to send to an FIU or actionable intelligence to be able to stop the transaction, right? So you've got a system where the false positives are definitely reduced. Only then would I recommend that you then have real-time monitoring. Why? Because your system has been primed and warmed enough well to be able to reduce false positives, make sure that it doesn't have any type of noise, and it only gives you the best amount of data possible, actionable data. And then you can have real-time monitoring and almost real-time action, meaning it will be able to reject on its own, approve on its own, escalate on its own. It does take time, and we're going to cover a lot of those at the end, but essentially that's the real goal. Okay, I said a lot of things really, really quickly, and I figured there are a couple of terms I want everyone to sort of learn, all over again. So I'm going to go into more detail. In supervised learning, what we do is we train models with labeled data. Labeled data is this. You've got a data of what is a type of financial instrument. So for example, this is a SEPA payment. This belongs to this customer category, right? You've got these types of labels on different pieces of information. That label itself might be sitting somewhere in your database. Because at some point when you're interacting with customers, well, your systems are calling all different types of transactions. And so it'll say, well, I'm looking for customers that are from X country. Well, if the country is labeled, it's going to be able to pull it directly. So that type of label data is super important for supervised learning because it recognizes, okay, this is country, this is transaction, this is customer, this is occupation, right? That type of labeling is super, super important. Now, unfortunately, and this is by practice, we know this, most data silos inside of financial institutions don't have labels. In fact, labeling is quite poor. Now, why is labeling quite poor in all institutions? There are a few explanations. The one thing I've observed the most is because the rapid sort of growth of a company and the amount of data that it gets, companies are more incentivized to act on it rather than analyze it. And when you act on a data almost immediately, you don't stop and sort of label it. You don't sort of classify it. And you'll have a lot of transaction, and we've seen this, where you've got a lot of rows where the occupation hasn't been well defined yet, or even the occupation that has been entered has not been labeled. It hasn't been said whether that's a valid occupation or an invalid occupation. A lot of times the data that's taken from sources that are not, let's say, the KYC form are added in KYC data. So now you've got more information from different sources that haven't been labeled. Here's another source of unlabeled data. Whenever you switch systems, so let's say you're using some type of CRM and you switch to another CRM. Well, guess what? You're going to lose data, take new ones, and you haven't sort of mapped them all together. You're going to have a cluster of unlabeled data. That's where using unsupervised learning is more important. Why? Because it doesn't care about the label itself. It cares more about the occurrence of that data point across multiple different types of typologies. And that's where it develops anomaly detection for the most part. All right, we did a lot of that, but really what I'd love for you guys to get a more comprehensive view, and this is where Aliyah always shines, is really bringing me down to earth, right? So I can go on and on about technology and how it works, but at the end of the day, it's only as good as how we use it. And so the best way to be able to show that is using a case study. Aliyah, you've got some case studies for us.
I do. Let's go on to the first one. So this first case study is around a financial institution that had a certain challenge. They were struggling with high volumes of false positives, something I'm sure many of you can relate to within your own organizations. They were using traditional transaction monitoring. It was leading to resource drain and delays in identifying genuine threats to the business. So what they did was they adopted AI-powered transaction monitoring system, and they utilized machine learning to analyze their historical data in order to really then identify what are the risks to the business. But I want to really get into what the practical considerations are over here, what you should think about when you're moving from traditional based transaction monitoring over to something that will utilize machine learning and AI. And some of the points Faisal touched around earlier when it comes to data labeling is so important to keep in mind, because before you decide to implement the new shiny system you've purchased, you really need to ensure that your data quality is good data. If you put in bad data, you're only going to get out bad data. Now, how do you do that? Well, you need to ensure that the historical data that's going to be used to train the machine learning models is well labeled. Going back to Faisal's point earlier, things around customer data, labeled appropriately when it comes to either if it's an address, whether it is either an individual's permanent address, the entity's business address, but particularly the payment messaging data labels. Different payment messages will have different payment fields. If you think about the SEPA payment, it will be different from your the payments in the UK, such as BACS and CHAPS. Also, payments that use ISO 20022 have many, many data fields. And all of that data is really useful if it's labeled correctly. So you need to ensure that if you're a global organization processing payments from different jurisdictions and different formats, you're using a solution which is payment type agnostic, but that also your data is labeled in such a way that it is consistent for the model to train on. Clean labeled data will not just improve the model effectiveness, it ensures that the model will continuously learn from the decisions your analysts make. So when your analysts discount an alert as a false positive, that would be the right decision to make. And where something is marked as a true positive requiring escalation or further investigations, again, you can have confidence within that decision. Another practical consideration to take in when you're moving from traditional to technology such as machine learning and AI for your transaction monitoring is to ensure that you're using the right model and also that you've tested it before you've pushed it into production and the live environment. So you need to consider a combination of both supervised and unsupervised learning models, ensuring that they can distinguish between what is a legitimate transactional behavior based on the historical decisions you've made and what would then be anomalous and suspicious transactions. Once you've tested the model with kind of real world scenarios that you have seen, you can then deploy it more safely, knowing that the model will be accurate. Another thing to think about is when you're using traditional transaction monitoring systems, you most likely are using static thresholds. So that is where you have a single threshold, such as alert me on payments over 10,000 euros, for instance. When you want to move towards AI and machine learning, you can have different variations of thresholds, but then also ensure that you're adjusting it based on how you're managing the initial alerts that are being triggered, because again, the model is learning from the actions that you are taking. And finally, feedback loops are really important. So when you are using a system that is reliant on machine learning and AI, you really need to ensure that when you review a transaction and you remediate the alert, you're actually feeding back to the model what the decision is that you have taken, whether it is to reject a transaction, to approve it, or to escalate it for a further kind of second line compliance team analysis. And again, this is what will really help the model learn and adapt over time, which improves the accuracy. The slide does show outcomes of that case. So as I was speaking, I hope you were able to read through it, but we're going to move on to our next case study. And the next case study is around cross-border so we're going to move on to, this is the cross-border transaction one. I think did we miss a slide, Faisal, around name screening?
Okay, yeah, AI-driven name screening and transaction monitoring.
Yeah, cool. All right, let's do that one. No worries. So in this case, the challenge here for the financial institution was again a high number of false positives that were being generated from their transaction monitoring system. This could have been caused by spelling variations or other different cultural naming conventions. So what they did was they implemented natural language processing to then handle those name variations and match against names on global watch lists more accurately. The outcomes of what this achieved was a reduction of the false positives and also a faster response time to managing the alerts, because you can really then allocate your resources to those higher risk alerts where you're actually seeing potential matches, as opposed to just kind of going through a whole bunch of alerts that are false positives and not really identifying where there is a potential true match. Now, there are a couple of practical considerations here that I'd love you to kind of keep in mind when you are implementing natural language processing. it's really helpful for organizations that have a global presence or where your customer base are going to be individuals from all different cultural backgrounds or jurisdictions, because that's where natural language processing can really understand linguistic variations, and it will then improve the matching accuracy. There also needs to be contextual data that's used. So for instance, looking at not just screening the name and the date of birth, but also additional factors such as the country of residence, country of nationality, country of origin, because then that can really help distinguish between individuals who have similar names, but are not necessarily the customer that you have screened, thereby reducing your false positives. We can then move on to the next case study. And this is around real-time cross-border transaction monitoring. Now, in this scenario, the challenge the financial institution had was handling cross-border transactions and monitoring complex money laundering schemes that were taking place across multiple jurisdictions, particularly useful when you want to identify organized crime groups that often operate cross borders and in different jurisdictions. What they did was they implemented an AI-driven real-time transaction monitoring system that was capable of analyzing the large volume of data, but also do it across border. They trained the model to detect specific trends and patterns that would indicate this type of structuring and layering of funds cross border. And that helped them then achieve improved detection via the system because they were using typologies. They were able to understand schemes where different currencies were used, potentially even higher risk jurisdictions and higher risk currency usage could be flagged by the system. And then also because it was real time, you can take real time action. So you could really be proactive here as opposed to reactive, which tends to be a space that a lot of, compliance professionals and analysts find themselves in when you're using traditional transaction monitoring systems. Some of the things you need to think about here when it comes to practically implementing this is the data integration across jurisdictions. I mentioned this previously when it comes to different payment messages and the different formats. It's really important that you have all your data labeled consistently. You're identifying different fields within that payment message. So not just who the counterparties are or counterparty banks, but the currency that's being used, any details around the address of the individual, additional data points that can really help identify movement of funds cross-border, but for the purposes of laundering monies, laundering proceeds of crime. And also feeding in different financial crime typologies and patterns where there are known jurisdictions that are involved or known currencies that are involved, either to evade sanctions or to create a shadow economy. Those types of typologies are really useful to feed in as a rule for the model to learn from and perform. And we can move on to the next case study or the next slide.
Yeah.
Thanks, Faisal.
Well, that's quite a bit of content there. Shall we just move on from the other case studies directly into traditional versus AI? Yeah.
Let's do that and let's learn more.
Okay, so we're going to do a quick recap of what we just covered. So obviously we've talked about, Aliyah talked about this about 5-6 slides ago, about the challenges of traditional versus AI-based transaction monitoring. One of the challenges that happens in traditional name screening is that traditional name screening just takes data off the fields directly. It doesn't give it any context at all whatsoever. And so what you end up having is just an array of false positives that are never tuned. And I remember the very first time I used a sanction screening program, this was in 2009, and I remember it was quite basic itself. And the only way that I would get any detection whatsoever is if the letters matched letter for letter. In fact, even if there was a spacing difference, it never caught it. So that's sort of one of the extreme cases, of course, of challenges in traditional name screening. But for the most part, these are the inherent challenges. Now, I want to jump onto the most exciting part, which is the natural language processing. As you can imagine, if you think about a person that is on a sanctions list, their name can be spelled in many different ways, phonetically, contextually, and might be even in a different language altogether, which alters the spelling. On top of that, if you're screening for entities or groups, well, there's a name of the group in the country that they're from. That group might be present in a different country whose language is different, and thereby the name of that group will be changed as well, right? It'll reflect the local language of that group itself. But they might be interacting with a financial institution that is transferring funds to another country where the language is also different there, and it'll just translate the original name. And so if you don't have sophisticated name screening, you're going to miss that itself, because it's always going to try to find the original spelling, the original construction of that name. So having natural language processing, which detects the language, searches for the original translation, looks for ways that it could have been written in another way. Because as you can imagine, if you write something in one language, it doesn't exactly transliterate to a different language. It has to find the same context and then tell you that it is also that entity after doing all that work. That just takes a lot more work, and that's where machine learning is really, really crucial. The other unsung hero in name screening that's not part of the machine learning is all other external data that you might not think are useful. And what do I mean by that? Well, compliance officers look only for the transactional data, KYC data, some amount of investigation data, but they miss out on this huge treasure trove of data that comes from the marketing campaigns, the account manager campaigns, any type of work your customer service is doing. All these interactions that they have with your customers are unbelievable sources of data that provide your models really great context. I'll give you a very simple one. Say you are using machine learning for transaction monitoring, and certain elements of your customers have alerts that occur only between 2 and 5 in the morning, because that's just something about your customers. Well, if anything happens at, let's say, 9 a.m., well, your model is going to think, well, that's not correct. For that customer, they generally transact between 2 and 5. Well, maybe you're missing some other data. What if your customer service had data that this customer always calls in at 9 in the morning or during that time for troubleshooting? What if your account manager knew that this person does his business in one area, but actually contacts them from a different country because that's where they actually live? That's contextual information that, again, is missed completely from the transaction monitoring model. So when I talk about integrating external data sources, I'm not talking about external data sources outside the walls of your company. I'm really talking about the other departments that you're not even looking at. They are unbelievable data points that will vastly, vastly improve any type of transaction monitoring you have using machine learning. Now, we've had a couple of case studies that Elias just talked about. So let's go on with some of the traditionals. First, linguistic variations. This is a very difficult one. This one has probably the biggest problems. In fact, central banks do routine testing on different vendors to be able to make sure that they're able to pass that type of linguistic variation. A certain group name, right, is going to be called and spelled differently. Let me give you an example. If you were to take the word Daesh, but then translate it to Arabic, and then have an Arabic pronunciation of that word, phonetically then changed back to English, the final spelling in that English word would be vastly different than the one initially. And that's one of the big challenges you have with traditional name screening. So machine learning is really great for that. Complex naming. I happen to have a simplistic name, so does Elia, but guess what? There are some Baltic names, for example, that have characters and symbols. They have attachments, they have umlauts, they have conjugal characters where the A and E are together. These are complex names where the person writing the name has a very ease of use, but when they put it into a system and it goes to a CRM banking software, it goes to the transaction processing software, it automatically changes it. That AE would push to an A. The umlaut would be disappeared. Any type of accents, for example, in French, you've got multiple accents on the E. Those have different pronunciations, and a system might not pick up on the fact that it's pronounced phonetically differently, and thereby not the same word. So the inability to sort of detect that type of complex names are really the big challenges from name screening. So the way machine learning does is this. It uses supervised learning. So in our situation, one of the things we do is that we have treasure troves of data, vast amounts of data that have all been trained, and we use that and we shine the light on your data and try to find the same thing. Now, there's a lot of your data that has not been modeled. In those cases, we apply unsupervised learning and we let it surprise us with all different types of anomalies, and we sort of review that. We also have entity resolution. Entity resolution is a very interesting thing that used to not be a problem up until the last, I would say, 7, 8 years ago, when globalization just became the standard norm. See, what happens is when you look at it, when you search up a certain company, the company doesn't exist in a vacuum. There are different levels of corporate structure to it. There are different UBOs. There are connected corporate structures. There is partial corporate structures. And really knowing all the different elements that form that entity itself requires a ton of different data. Because, and for this a very simple reason, when you onboarded that entity, you didn't get the full information. Your account manager, your sales team got one part of the information. When you went to go search that entity inside of a database itself, it didn't have the full information. Then you might need to search the business extract to know the full picture of that company itself. That type of entity resolution is extremely difficult, and that's one of the big challenges traditional systems have. Machine learning is great because what it can do is it can take all these little pieces of data that form the basis of that person or their company and put it together and say, okay, these pieces of data are resolved to this entity. So that's what it is. When you're looking at Faisal Incorporated, I've got all these pieces of information and it all resolves exactly to that entity itself. So entity resolution is something that's started becoming a big problem about 8, 9 years ago. But luckily, a few companies have sort of solved that. All right, natural language processing. This is the most interesting one because nowadays, what's going to happen from not only this year but sort of going forward the next 10 years, folks are not necessarily going to be giving instructions to computers by clicks and keyboards. They're really going to be speaking it. So at a first level, when you're giving instruction to a machine to transfer money, or when you're giving it instructions to analyze something, you have to sort of form a way to provide language and context to that machine. Now, the big challenges I've seen, for example, with different types of language models, specifically in NLP, is that most of the data sets are based on the English language or Latin characters. And unfortunately, most of the models have not been trained on non-Latin characters and non-English characters. So you miss a lot of the nuances, a lot of the euphemisms, idioms of the English language itself. So having a lot of this training model is super important. Next is phonetic meaning. Did you know that there are 5 different ways to spell my name, Faisal? In fact, one of the things everyone always asks me is, how do I pronounce your name? Is it Faisal? Is it Faisal? Well, depending on how you pronounce it, it would be spelled differently. So my name, Faisal, can be spelled Faycal, Faizal. I have seen Faezal, Feizal, Fezal. So all these different spellings have a big impact because, as you can imagine, systems that are picking up your names, especially remittance corridors, when you're talking about people that are remitting money or receiving money, a lot of times they're not actually writing their names. They might just be offering their name to the remittance operator who writes it as they hear it, and they might not be writing it as is corrected on their identification. And that can basically mean the difference between you picking up on that person's name or not picking it up. So you need a system that is trained in all the different phonetic differences in that name spelling itself. And second, contextual analysis. I'll give you a really good example. Say you are a Nigerian remittance company, and really the basis of your business is remitting transactions from the US to Nigeria. That's it, right? Well, if you find James Smith in that name itself, maybe you need to take a second look because there are not a lot of James Smiths that are going to be sending money to Nigeria. It's generally going to be folks of Nigerian origin. And so that's one of the ways you can sort of review that because it doesn't provide good context. In the context of the names that you should be seeing, that's not one that should appear. All right. Now, Aliyah talked about fuzzy matching itself. One of the things I want you guys to know is if you were to sort of install any type of name screening vendor itself, make sure you have at least 2 of the following algorithms. The first is Levenstein distance, and the second was Yakar similarity. Now, either of those perform really well. Levenstein is one of the earliest, oldest. By old, I mean going back to the 70s algorithm. It's not really the most advanced one. Jakar similarity is a few decades later. So those are a little bit better. And then phonetic algorithms are much newer. So these are the ones that can pick up on the different ways that Faisal sounds and how they could be also be written. So these three algorithms are what you're looking for in any type of system that you're picking. So if you're an AML specialist and you're looking to install a name screening provider, one of the things you'll ask them is, can you tell me the three different algorithms that you have? And if they tell you that they don't have these three algorithms at a minimum, close the call, go to somebody else. Because really what you're looking for at a minimum is these three algorithms for that type of fuzzy data algorithms. All right, integrating external data. A lot of your salespeople have CRM data. They either pick it up from their marketing campaigns, they get leads, right? A lot of your salespeople get lead generators and feeds itself. Those are amazing amounts of data to be able to get. Now, that's good data, but what other data do you need? Well, the watch lists. Now, if you are engaging in KYC or individual related verification, you're in luck. There is the list providers are a commodity, and the brand names, we don't have to mention it. There are 10, 20 different brand names itself. So any one of those lists are totally fine. If you are, however, working with KYB and you are doing business verification, unfortunately, the number of tools that are perfect for KYB related or entity data or business extract are not many. But you can integrate all of them. At the end of the day, it doesn't actually matter where your list comes from. What matters is what you do with that list. Solution providers like us, we're agnostic of the list. It just matters how well we're taking that list and what kind of algorithms are we pushing through it, what kind of entity resolutions we're having. Public records, business registrars, where the country permits. As we know, not all countries have a corporate have a UBO that is public. Some of them are quite private. However, a lot of countries are. As an example, the UK, Germany have very, very public records and business registrars. So getting the data from there to supplement the additional data about your entity is super, super important and definitely can help. Adverse media negative news screening. We all know what this is. Essentially, as a compliance officer, one of the things you need to do is find any alerts if that named person showed up in any reputable journal or media article. Why is that important? Well, if they did something while they're a client of yours, perhaps you need to know. If, for example, they were arrested for embezzlement, yeah, maybe you need to take a look whether they funneled those proceeds to your institution. So that's the basis of adverse media. Well, adverse media actually has really good data on name resolution. Why? Their legal names sometimes are there, or their middle names, their aliases will show up there. In any type of media or journal records that have arrests, it's going to show up. If you, for example, are connected to solutions that are also looking into the Panama files or all those type of journalistic triggers where they unearth huge amounts of data, you're going to find a lot more ways of how these companies were named, different aliases they went by because they use these aliases to hide themselves. Those are extremely useful for your name screening as well because it's possible they use those aliases to actually, transact through you. So all these types of external data, not only internally inside of your walls, but the external data that you can find are incredibly useful for all types of really optimal name screening. All right, I'm going to take a break here, but I really want to hear what Aliyah has to say here about some case studies on successful implementation.
Yeah, what that was the most enjoyable part so far of today's session because I learned so many new concepts that you hear vendors talking about, especially those fuzzy matching algorithms of the Lichtenstein theory and all the other ways of doing it. And to know that all three should be adopted is super useful because oftentimes some vendors just have one or the other. And they explain it in such a manner that it kind of goes over, well, it goes over my head. So that was super useful. The case studies we talked about earlier, touched upon these outcomes that are listed here on the slide. So it doesn't matter if you're a large global financial institution or even if you're a startup, scale up, fintech, the use cases that we talked about for machine learning and AI are going to be used for all sorts of industries. The main purpose there being accurate detection and then also a reduction in noise and false positives. I really liked what Faisal talked about when he talked about the use of data other than your CDD information or the information obtained directly from the customer. So really looking across your organization as to the other touch points where you're getting the data around your customer, the CRM system, marketing campaigns, even things around how your customers using their device, using your online portal, your web portal, can really prove useful. So thank you, Faisal, for talking about that, because that really does help you reduce the false positives, but not just that, really kind of understand what your customer is doing. Because even if it looks suspicious or unusual, maybe for your customer in the space that they're operating in or working in, that is usual behavior. And of course, all the different types of lists you talked about, whether it's the watch list or the adverse media, it really helps identify where your customer could be a risk to your business. And also the sanctions element, where you really need that entity resolution that Faisal talked about in more detail when it comes to not just looking at the entity, but also sub-related entities and really understanding the ownership chain and who's involved. So super useful takeaways. And again,
Yeah.
just remind you guys, if you've got questions, pop them into the chat. I know Faisal is responding to them as and when you are putting them in to keep this.
Well, I'm not responding to them just yet.
You
I think
haven't? Okay.
yeah, but we're gonna have a chance to be able to
Okay.
respond it. Now,
Fantastic.
the one thing, Aliyah, that's been bugging me is
Yeah.
that I think people are not asking enough questions about something that's quite overlooked and important, which is where's the ethics in this, right? You're talking about large troves of data. You're allowing machines to make decisions on your behalf. Um, Machines are not compassionate. They're not trained with ethics. And they really will only act as ethical as the models and the institutions that are housing them. So there's some like significant sort of things that are overlooked. I'd love for you to sort of guide us through this.
Absolutely. Now, one of the kind of main challenges when you think of it from a regulator's perspective is that they don't have people like Faisal who have not only the compliance and regulatory acumen, but also that he's a technologist. He understands the data science behind how these models are working. So that's really where regulators are trying to understand how this technology is being built, how it's being used. And their primary concern is around making sure that all of these models are explainable. They're concerned about the lack of transparency. So as they build up their teams and they bring these types of expertise in-house, we are going to see a phrase where regulators are going to want to understand how different firms are using machine learning and AI. They're going to be defining best practices before they start to really lay down hard regulations on how machine learning and AI needs to be used within the industry. Now, when I refer to the kind of the lack of transparency, I'm talking about what is known as the black box problem. So that's where you have kind of complex models that are using technology such as deep learning networks. They are providing highly accurate results, but you don't really know how they've made the ultimate decision. And that is a concern when you think about privacy and general data protection regulations, such as the GDPR, similarly with the UK Data Protection Act, where consent is really needed from data subjects on how you're using their data, but also where you're making automatic decisions off the back of that data. So let's go on to the next slide, Faisal. And before we get into kind of what are the key concerns from a regulator's aspect, I also want to really talk about how this technology is helping you also be compliant and meet your regulatory obligations. Because when you're able to identify unusual and suspicious activity, it helps you with the suspicious activity reporting requirements you have as a regulated institution, where you need to make timely reports to the financial intelligence unit in the country you operate on suspicious transactions, suspicious customers. And you really need to provide enough context and narrative and intelligence to your FIU in order for them to really understand what's happening, for them to connect it with other cases that they might be looking at, and really hold individuals to account. But not just that, for them to get court orders for asset freezes. Because what we're ultimately trying to do here is not just have a smooth operating process. We're really trying to stop financial crime from proliferating, and we're trying to identify the bad actors and seize proceeds of crime so that we can deprive them of the benefits that they thought they derived from criminal activities. So you're meeting your suspicious activity reporting obligations. It helps you meet your KYC, KYB, customer due diligence obligations, which again are regulatory requirements across the world. We also need to identify sanctioned individuals, connected sanctioned parties, relatives, close associates, and also politically exposed persons because they carry a risk when it comes to bribery and corruption. Again, these are all really hard defined regulatory requirements that these solutions can really help you address and comply with. Um, it can also be used to keep on top of regulatory updates. So as you're using this type of technology, really keep an eye out on what regulators are saying and what's on the horizon. Like Faisal made a really good point earlier when he was like, 5, 10 years from now, it's not going to be kind of our customers manually kind of putting in a prompt for payments or wanting to do their banking or any other type of service. It could actually just be a verbal message because we're moving toward a world where, we're already doing verbal prompts with AI assistants and whatnot. So really kind of keeping a pulse on what that regulatory horizon is really important. And then maintaining human oversight. That's really important. And as we go on to the next slides, I'm going to talk about what I mean by this human oversight and what regulators expect from this. So from a regulator's perspective, they really want to ensure that models can be interpreted. The reason being is that they want to ensure that organizations are treating customers fairly and that all decisions that are being made are made fairly and without bias. So there needs to be adequate explainability that compliance teams can also understand when they're making decisions off the back of the alerts that they're seeing coming through from the models. Regulators are really focusing on audits. Now, these can be regulatory audits, but these can also be audits from partner banks or other third parties you work with. Auditing how the model has been built. What are the data sources that are feeding into that model? How is the data being kept accurate and up to date? What type of models you're using, such as whether it's supervised or unsupervised, and how certain features are selected that then feed into the decision-making process. All of this really needs to be documented in a model methodology document because that is what a regulatory audit is going to look at. So a step-by-step documentation on how your model is trained, how you regularly tune it, what is the frequency that you tune it, and how decision thresholds have been set. It's also important to ensure that there's trust and accountability. So going back to why you need to do more, have a methodology document in the first place, take it through a governance process within your organization, but also ensure that you perform annual, if not more frequent, audits is to ensure that you can trust the output of your model. Because at the end of the day, you are accountable for the decisions you make, especially where there could be a risk of model bias involved. Now, post hoc explainability is a concept where you want to be able to kind of look back and assess what was the decision that your model made and was that decision appropriate? Think about things like quality assurance checks, QC checks, really ensuring that you understand that your analysts actually who are receiving the initial alerts have a clear understanding of why a certain transaction is suspicious. If you're thinking about name screening, what are the different types of algorithms that are used in order to then screen that name against a wide set of watch lists and databases. There are solutions that you can then kind of use within your models in order to get that explainability. So also look at how you can kind of just use an application to build out that explainability. And also on the next slide, we're going to talk about kind of, having continuous monitoring, human in the loop oversight as well, which I didn't mention before. But when we think about training bias, the training data bias, over here, we're essentially talking about where the data that you use to train your model is biased from the beginning. Now, an example of this could be where you have identified a segment of customers based on, let's say, their nationality, which you consider to be a high-risk feature. That could be a bias because not necessarily customers of a specific nationality are going to be high risk. It's really what are they doing? What are their payments showing you? What are their business activities showing you? That is the risk factor also what are the products that they're using with you that could be higher risk. If you're not periodically reviewing and doing post hoc reviews on your model, essentially that bias is going to continue being generated, and the training that your model is based on is going to output results that are not accurate. And so that's why you really need to kind of look into that. But it could also be the algorithmic bias. So algorithmic bias would be, for example, if your name screening is not taking into consideration all the different types of algorithms that Faisal mentioned. Maybe you're just using one, like the Lichtenstein model, but that's really old, and things have changed and globalization has taken effect, and maybe that singular algorithm is not going to give you the best results. There's it's When we think about how can we remove the bias and ensure that it's not present, it's really important to use diverse representation of training data. So you can have your customer set, but if it's not diverse enough to represent a vast array of different data segments, then maybe think about using more kind of dummy data, which is diverse and provides a greater representation in order to train that model on. There's also something known as operational bias. Now, operational bias is in relation to the decisions that are being made off the back of, the alerts that the model is generating or the intelligence it's giving you. If, for instance, you have analysts making decisions incorrectly, closing alerts as either true positives when they should be false positives, the model is going to learn from those decisions, which would then bring about an operational bias on the future output of that model. So again, kind of considering quality assurance, quality control checks periodically over the year on your model is really important. And then, of course, documenting those results. There are bias detection tools, I mentioned them earlier, that can be used to identify whether the model is potentially performing in a biased manner. And that is something that could speed up your quality assurance and quality control tests, especially if you do not have a singular team to do that monitoring and testing for you. And finally, continuous monitoring and feedback. You need analysts to be able to feed back to the model. What are the decisions that they've made? Where they identify any issues or kind of errors with the model output, or something doesn't seem right, there needs to be a way to track that, feed that back to a model governance team so that it can be looked into. And now let's move back to regulatory concerns. So I talked about privacy and the data protection concerns. And this is essentially an issue that's not only prevalent in Europe, it's in the UK, and it's across the world. It's if you're using a single model and you have customers across the world, how is that data being shared? Do you have consent to share that data? How is that data being stored? Is it being retained safely? All the basic considerations you would have when it comes to data protection also apply to the data that is being used to train your models and that your models are working off. Sometimes it's also important when you're especially cross-border data sharing is to have data that is anonymized or pseudonymized. So especially where you are sharing it across different jurisdictions, you don't want the data to be transparent enough that you can actually identify the data subject. Now, along with transparency is the consent. It's very important that you consider, especially where you're making automatic decisions, where a model is essentially matching a customer as a high-risk customer and you are automatically declining that customer for your business based on what the model output is without any human intervention, that you have consent from your customer, who will be the data subject, in order to make those automatic decisions. It's also really relevant in cases like credit risk, where you're making automatic credit decisions on whether a customer should have a loan or not. So it's really important to understand what is the use case, number one, of your model, and whether that model is making decisions, and if so, whether you have consent to do it. The reason being is that you really need to balance data protection with the need to be compliant with anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing, and your sanctions legislation obligations. They both go hand in hand. And it's really important that you consider the processes you have in place across a customer's life cycle to ensure that you're meeting data protection requirements, but also being able to identify suspicious or high-risk customers to your business. aligning with what regulators are expecting as well. So keeping a pulse on what direction the regulators are going in, what are the types of specific concerns they're raising, in order to ensure that you're actually documenting that in governance and committee forums and talking about it, so that you have minutes being recorded that actually, as an organization, when you're using this type of technology, senior management and executives are aware that these types of models are being used and what the risks are and what the benefits are for them. And finally, data access controls. It goes back to the privacy side of data and how you're retaining the data, how you're storing the data, who is accessing the data. So if you have a large technology team that can access models and train the models, that is perhaps where you might want to kind of sanitize some of the data that they have access to, which is very sensitive customer data, so that they can still perform their roles as technologists or data scientists without having access to personal sensitive data. And we can move on to the next slide, Faisal. If you'd like to
Sure.
add any
I
point,
mean, I'm absorbing all of that. One of the things is that, you know, you see over the years the responsibilities of a compliance officer, how it increases over time. And now one of the things that they might consider doing is, let's say, upgrading their, transaction monitoring or regulatory technology system with AI. And now they have to consider all of these different items. So they have to get buy-in from their privacy compliance officer or whoever's in charge of the data security officer as well. And they have to learn how all of these have a huge impact. Some large organizations have ethics and bias compliance officers as well. So getting all these buy-ins and people inside is really, really important. Now, imagine you've gotten buy-in and you've selected the solution that's right for you. Well, one of the things you'll have to do is get through what's called the implementation process. And that is, it could be as easy as you can make it to be, or it could be exactly like pulling teeth. So here are sort of a couple of steps you need to figure out. First, you ask the solutions technology company to provide you all the areas of the steps involved. In our experience, generally SaaS implementations take between 48 hours and 3 months. I know that's not the norm in some cases, but really what I would suggest, as those of you that are in the that are compliance officers and are choosing to implement some type of regulatory solution provider, my suggestion would be that you tell the solution provider, first of all, tell me what your general steps are. Give to me all the way from the very beginning to the end. What are all the things I need to do? Who are all the people I need to pull in? What are the data sources you need to review? Who are the other positions and roles that you need input from? Give me all of that. Once you've gotten all of these elements from your solutions provider, the next thing is tell me all the types of data you need me to map towards you. What type of data do you need? Which country, which type of customer, product, etc. Line them all up. And then you get the technology folks in. So then you get your either IT or the developers on your end or the engineers that are going to help integrate with the solutions vendors. So all these steps are sort of what's required. Now, implementation never goes on really well this way. Why? Because you've got a lot of technologists, but not a lot of subject matter experts, meaning you don't have most of the AML folks in. In fact, ML officers are busy enough trying to sort of review transactions ongoing. And they are the minority in the integration space. So make sure you assign either yourself as the compliance expert of your company or your most trusted compliance expert to be part of that integration. Have them be part of that integration because at the end of the day, they're the end user. So how it should be implemented and what kind of outputs they're looking for depends on them. And don't wait for the testing period to start looking in. Make sure you have milestones where you can keep testing it. Now, the second part of it is collaboration. Well, the collaboration is already a little bit past that because you've already sort of signed the contract, but there are other ways to collaborate. You'd be surprised to know that a lot of the solutions providers, ours included, have other experts that are subject matter experts on the items and that come part of the service. And if you don't ask for it, they won't necessarily offer it. So go ahead and ask them, hey, do you have anyone say, for example, you are a corporate trust service provider, right? Go ahead and ask, do you have a subject matter expert that knows about corporate trust service providers and how we're supposed to use your solution? You'd be surprised how that kind of sort of question can be incredibly collaborative because this person not only has your perspective and experience, but they know exactly how it should be implemented for someone like you. So that kind of collaboration is super important. There have been situations where there's another type of collaboration which is needed, which is the actual IT implementation. You might not have the developers and engineers and IT professionals on staff to be able to integrate with that solutions vendor. So you should hope and cross your fingers that the solutions vendor that you have comes with an integration specialist who knows how to integrate your systems with theirs. In the event you don't have one, you'll have to find another solutions provider that can help you collaborate. So that's super important before you start sort of talking to a lot of these companies and so on. Find out whether you have on staff a technology specialist to integrate with the AML solutions that you want, or find out whether the AML solutions comes with their integration specialist. Because I've seen a lot of projects go, and fortunately not with us, but in my past career, projects go DOA, dead on arrival. When the contract's signed, the CFOs are happy and everything, but then the integration lines up and they say, well, who's going to integrate from your end? And the customer says, well, I don't have anyone. I'm the compliance officer. I have one IT person. He does some amount of hardware and servicing, but he's sort of maintaining our website as well. He just doesn't have time to integrate this. And the project goes DOA because you just don't have anyone to be able to integrate it. And there's only so much the vendor can do, and they don't have an integration specialist for you. So that type of collaboration, not only expert level and IT level, is super, super important. Okay, the third part, and this is Aliyah touched about this, and she's, hopefully I'll invite her to talk a little bit more about this. You're putting in a new tool, an absolutely new tool. It's not just part of your compliance program. It's a new way of working. It's a new way of looking at alerts. It's a new way of analyzing and dispositioning alerts. You need to train them. You need to train them on how to use it. So ask your regulatory section solutions provider, how much training am I going to get? I've never worked with machine learning models before. My staff never has. My staff just learned about machine learnings 3 weeks ago from your sales professional. We were impressed by it, but we still need training. You need to show us, what do these mean? How do I recognize an overfitted model? How do I recognize outputs that are not in line with my transactional data? That type of training is super important. And by all means, ask your regulatory solutions provider to give you the absolute basics. So if their training to you does not resemble the first 30 minutes that Aliyah and I just did on starting with the basics of machine learning and AI, if it doesn't start with that, you've got a little bit of a problem. You should ask them to provide you all the way from basic training to more advanced training on how to use that tool. It's just like any other tool. For example, your car, you absolutely need to know the absolute basics before you start driving it. And this is no different than any other business tool. You need to learn the basics all the way from the fundamentals to the actual tool itself. A lot of times, regulatory solutions provider go deep into the features. You can do all these crazy things here. Look at this feature. It does this, it does that. You can pull up the alerts. Hold on for a second. How is this alerts actually being generated? Teach me the basics about it so I understand the output that it comes with. So those kind of trainings are super, super important. And make sure as the software improves, because hopefully you've got a regulatory solutions provider that's pushing new releases and updating new features. As new features come in, make sure they've scheduled training time with you and saying, these are the new features that have come up, right? And they keep pushing those new sort of training and upskilling towards you. All right. So this is a summary of these are the summaries. This is the summary of the steps that I talked about integrating with existing AML systems. First, you might have existing AML systems such as your onboarding and KYC provider. You might have a case management system that is also different. And in the middle, you're putting your AI-based transaction monitoring model and system. Well, make sure you've got integration between both ends, because you need your onboarding, risk assessment, due diligence data to feed into your transaction monitoring system that feeds also into your case management. So find out the gaps between that you have and what kind of system gaps you need to account for. Now, if you know you've got 100 customers you're onboarding and you should be expecting to see at least 2 to 3 alerts, that's your KPI that you should be monitoring for. Am I getting more alerts than I did before I put in the efficient system, or am I getting lesser alerts? The trick is, before you sign a contract with a regulatory solutions provider, or before you sign your agreement with them, do a little bit of soul searching and introspection and finding how many alerts do I get now? That way, you can compare whether your new system is actually efficient, right? Because you're mapping, okay, I used to get 100 alerts every 100 days. After the system going on for 3 months, I'm averaging roughly about 20 alerts every 100 days. That's a pretty good improvement. But in order to do that, you need to make sure that prior to using a new system, you've already gotten the general alerts and KPIs. In fact, if your regulatory solutions provider, while you're talking to them, does not ask you, say, I see you're reviewing AML transaction monitoring providers that are AI-based, and thank you for speaking with us. Can I ask you, how many alerts do you actually see now every 100 days? If they're not asking you for this, chances are they don't really care about the KPIs you should be looking out for, because they don't want you to remember the efficiencies and try to measure them. But it's really important that you get that right away. Okay. Don't be shy to ask for what's called a pilot program. It's not something that regulatory solutions providers like to do, us included. We don't generally like it because essentially it's a lot of work where there's not a lot of economics involved. But feel free to ask it. There could be a business case for pilot programs. There are certain situations where we actually allowed for what we call proof of concept programs. And that was because this customer, I'll give you an example. It happened 2 months ago. A customer of ours onboarded corporate entities from high-risk jurisdictions. And they actually didn't have a solution for that. The problem is that they needed to understand how would the output actually be, because they had a massive CRM and an ERP system, which all of these customers are connected to. And they actually didn't know how it would happen, because prior to that, they used to only do it manually. So they wanted to have a pilot program for the purpose of synchronizing their CRMs and ERP systems together. For those of you, ERP systems are your invoicing, billing, pay accounting systems all together. So they wanted that POC really to make sure that it orchestrates really well with all the other systems in place. Go ahead and ask for it. In fact, the worst thing they can tell you is no, which should be fine. But you know what you can actually ask for? You can ask for a pilot program that's sort of defined, so on a 3-month basis, for example, with a far reduced cost, with a smaller transaction mode, so that at least you can test to see whether you like it. It's what we call your try it before buy it. AML transaction monitoring systems are the only B2B SaaS in the entire space where there isn't much of a try it before buy it mechanism. There are, if you are a startup, there are some programs that allow you to have it for free, but that's not really try it before you buy it. Most enterprises are not startups, and so you need to find a way to be able to test the system, see whether it works for you, whether you like it. More than that, learn from it. In fact, that pilot program is an excellent way to learn and train your staff on when the actual production data comes in. Next. Likely you have integration with some legacy systems. What do I mean by legacy systems? Well, I'm going to behave, and I'm not going to mention the exact brands because I've got colleagues that work there. So I'm not going to mention sort of, badmouth it because they're legacy systems, but they are formidable legacy systems. For some reason or another, your institution has decided not to switch out from. It's fine. It might also be that it's a dependency for a lot of your systems and architecture because they feed into a CRM. So you're forced to stay with that legacy system. It's fine. But prior to onboarding, ask your solutions vendor. And if we're the lucky ones to be with you, ask us, look, we actually use this CRM, we use this other tool. Do you know how to integrate with this? First of all, these are unavoidables. Do you have a replacement for it? If you don't have a replacement for it, can you integrate with it? Because that ultimately is what's going to determine the success of your transaction monitoring system. I have seen legacy systems that span 30 years. I saw last year a customer of ours have a legacy system that was DOS based, where I don't know, maybe my age is showing here, but DOS essentially is an operating system that's very, very old. It works on sort of a Unix based input. You can't use a mouse. It's only keyboard based, and you sort of have to go from field to field. So it had a DOS based operating system, and it needed, and one part of your system still worked on that. It was essentially their point of sale systems, and we had to integrate with it, which is fine. There are ways to be able to map it, but make sure you ask those questions before it, because unfortunately, I have seen, and so I've worked with other regulatory solutions providers, and I know that they've sort of abrogated the contracts if the legacy systems were too old to integrate with. So if that's a requirement for you, make sure you ask that question ahead of time. And finally, scaling the AI solution. And I've seen some questions come up related to this. They ask about how big of a data set do I need, right? At what point am I satisfied that the model will do what it's supposed to do? So remember we talked about the pilot program and then going sort of from small to a lot of transactions. That's really great. That's a really great way to start scaling your solution. So you can start scaling the transactions that you want fed in. Maybe you don't want all the countries. Maybe you just want transactions from one set of countries to be monitored. You like the results, it's great. Move it to another country category. And let's say you're keeping it for one product. Add a second product as part of it. It's okay to be able to take a sort of gradual process before you scale it through the entire organization. I always suggest for that. A lot of other sort of regulatory solutions providers don't, because they'd like to get all the revenue right away. But I've seen situations where it breaks very often, right? So transaction data from one country works really, really well, but it doesn't scale up to another country. Why? Well, remember we talked about phonetic differences in the names, transactional differences. If you're a global organization and you're in Europe and in the US and maybe in Africa, you're going to have 3 different transaction messages, right? In Europe, you're going to have SEPA. In Africa, you're going to have various amounts of mobile money messages. In the US, you might actually be engaging in SWIFT transfers. These all have different messages. So your AI solution needs to adapt to them. And so it's really important that you take a step-by-step approach before you scale it altogether. Finally, my final note on collaborating with technology vendors and experts is the following. When you are choosing the right vendor, make sure that they can customize the rules. One of the things we do really well, and I know a few others do as well, is they look at your way of working internally. And your way of working internally might be, we've got sort of 3 analysts, 2 of them look at it at the same time, and we escalate to 1 person. That's what we call a workflow optimization. Well, make sure that they can customize the workflow to reflect that way. At the end of the day, it's your product. You get to decide how it is. Some other customizations might be, well, we want these types of scenarios to be detected because it's really, really innate to our business. Luckily, we work with 5 different verticals, but maybe you are an FX or foreign exchange service provider. The kind of transactions you'll be monitoring are very different. I'll give you an example. Foreign exchange service provider compliance officers are only reviewing at the time of deposit and the time of withdrawal. There isn't any intra-transactional activity to look at. In contrast to our insurance customers, the AML compliance officer of an insurance company is not really looking at the input. He's looking at the policy and the redemption times. So he needs scenarios that detect those. If it's an EMI, well, the EMIs are looking at the entries. They're looking at the AML impact of the entries. Where is it coming from? How was it deposited? What was the payment instrument used? So these type of customized scenarios, ask for it. Ask for it to be put in. If there are practices that you as a firm had, make sure they customize those scenarios for you. Ongoing support and collaboration, by far the most underrated one. Look for a regulatory solutions provider going forward from now for the next 10 years that invest in the human support. There is a high tendency and addiction to outsource a lot of your support and collaboration to AI. I think one of the best ways you can provide sort of support is on a human basis, especially with compliance officers, for the very simple reason that a compliance officer in all of our institutions, and I know this as being one myself, is that you're incredibly alone sometimes. And you probably are the only person that's using the system. And no, there isn't really, you might have a small team around, but really you're the only person using it. So when you've got an issue, you don't want to have to resort to like chatbots. You want to make sure that on the other side of the screen is another person, an individual who's going to be able to help you on an ongoing basis. And so you don't feel alone, even if you might feel alone in your workplace. So make sure that the service providers you're working with have a human touch to their ongoing support and collaboration. And finally, ask your technology vendors, do you have experts on staff? Can you connect me to experts on staff? My favorite thing to do is one of our compliance officers in our customers ask us, we're going to be expanding to country X. Do you know someone who specializes in that? Yes, I absolutely do. You know who I connect them with? another client compliance officer, because we already know which one of our compliance officers is a specialist in what country and what area. And it's my most fun thing to be able to connect two compliance officers that are client of ours to each other. That is by far one of the best things. So make sure you engage external experts that you don't have to go out and pay for. Ask your technology vendor if they can find individuals that can help you. And those individuals might be their own customers as well, who are more than happy to talk to another person who's also a client that are using the same system. So really sort of clever way to be able to get that external expert in. AI experts, well, I don't know many financial institutions that are going to be investing in a compliance officer that comes to senior management and says, look, we've been buying this and using this expensive system. Can we get an AI analyst on staff as well? And can we hire them specifically for AML compliance? Like, that's one of those things that will never going to be uttered or answered to. I get it. One of the things you can do, again, is ask your technology vendor, hey, you guys are using AI experts. Do you figure I can use them for about an hour and ask some questions towards them? I just had some questions about basic AI things that could be useful for me. You'd be surprised if you ask that question, how quickly they'll say, of course, yeah, absolutely. Here's your email address. Go ahead and book some time with them. They'll be more than happy to talk to you about it. And you would be amazed at how AI data scientists love talking about their work, right? They get to work sort of silently and quietly, and no one really asks them any questions. So if you sort of ask them questions about their craft, they're more than happy to spend time with you. So go ahead and engage with that. If you realize, when I just talked about engaging external AML and AI experts, I basically gave you tips and tricks that will cost you nothing, because those experts, both on the subject matter and the AI itself, should be available as your technology vendors, and that's where you get a lot of that information from. Now, the one thing I did promise you that we should talk a little more about is training and upskilling. And Aliyah, please tell us a little bit more about this.
Thank you so much, Faisal. I cannot stress the importance of collaborating with your software provider. It's going to kind of lead into the training and the upskilling of your AML compliance teams. But most importantly, if you are the buyer, you are the purchaser of the product, you're the chief compliance officer, money laundering reporting officer, head of FinCrime Ops, you really need that collaboration and that relationship with your provider in order to understand how their technology is being used. And having been on the vendor side, having worked in the technology space, and also as a compliance officer in banks, I cannot stress how important it is to have that strategic vision in mind to look for that strategic partner. Now, earlier I talked about the importance of having your model methodology documentation, being able to explain the MI. Because you're purchasing it from a software provider, you're not in control of how the model is working. Yes, your teams are making the ultimate decision and are feeding into the model, which the model is training on, but the actual model has been built by a third party. So it's important to realize that the regulatory obligations are still on yourself as the regulated organization. You cannot outsource your regulatory obligations onto the software provider. So really getting all that information, like Faisal said, from the very beginning will also help you build up your governance around how you treat models, so that if you are ever asked by an auditor or a regulator, how are models working, you already have the information to hand. It's also important that you have these dialogues so you can understand how the software provider is updating their model, how they're testing it, tuning it, and ensuring that there's no biases being involved so that it's not a black box. Now, once you, as the senior compliance officer, understand what's working, how it works, and you're comfortable with it, you now need to train the analysts who are actually using the software. These can be more junior members of staff. They might not have enough kind of AI acumen. So really helping them build up that basic AI literacy is really important. Discussions like we're having today can help with that. Like Faisal said, speaking to your technology provider and having them maybe speak to your team, not just the implementation team, but also speaking to the analyst teams once you've signed on the dotted line and you've decided to go ahead with them, can really help build up your analysts' confidence in using the system, because they need to understand the basic fundamentals of how AI and machine learning works, but they also need to understand how their decisions, how they remediate alerts or make a decision off the back of a screening result will impact the model going forward. So the risks that are involved over there. Also, they need to understand how they can interpret AI outputs. We talked about entity resolution quite earlier on, but some providers are giving graph analytics, kind of graph models of how one entity can, have multiple subsidiaries, and then ultimately who is the kind of beneficial owners and the UBOs. Being able to identify, being able to interpret those outputs are really important for your analyst teams. Also, when you think about adverse media, understanding and having your analysts understand and your teams understand what are the sources that are being fed in for adverse media, for instance. What are the sources of the watch list? What does a watch list match mean? Is it for fitness and propriety? Is it a match against a law enforcement list? Is it a match against a disqualified directors list? What does this really mean? So even getting your vendor kind of provide you with a kind of document of all the glossary codes for the sanctions list, for the watch list that they screen against, can really then help your team make an informed decision whether an alert is meaningful or not, and how to then deal with it. It's important to have regular training programs as well. So ongoing training on how your AI system, how the AI system is evolving, whether you're adding new data inputs. For instance, if you're branching into a new product space, which is going to have a different type of payment messaging or format, or you're scaling into a new jurisdiction, it's all going to change the way the model is working. So having your teams understand that if something's flagged for a cross border, for a high risk currency, what are those high risk currencies? How is the model working? And then also just keeping them in the loop of regular check-ins with your vendor, because again, it's a strategic relationship that you want to build here with your software provider. It's not just sign the dotted line and then we're never going to see you again after implementation. You want to have that ongoing engagement to learn how they're also building out their product features, because chances are they're also innovating within their space. And those innovations are going to translate into more operational efficiencies for you. Another important thing is to ensure that you're upskilling teams with advanced analytical skills, because you're going to have the model kind of do those lower skill tasks of, maybe automatically closing alerts that are true, false positives, assessing the risk of a certain transaction and having a transactional risk score. Your teams can actually really be upskilled to do more deeper investigations off the back of the information presented to them. So upskilling them around data literacy, how kind of data is used, what kind of data would be meaningful, how they can leverage data across the organization to really help them then focus on trends where risk is increasing in the organization, trends around different types of products within your business that are generating higher risks. So all of those types of thematic reviews you can really help your teams do more of, as opposed to kind of doing those low-level tasks. I'm also going to talk about KPIs here, because you also need your teams to understand what kind of key performance indicators are you measuring against. And like Faisal says, you really need to share those with your software provider so they also understand how are you going to measure their performance. Not just that, at the very early stages, your teams need to understand the impact of the number of false positive alerts they're having and ongoing budgeting for your team. What does that mean in terms of you needing to secure budget for more resources? From a vendor's perspective, they can help you build out your business case for then adopting a new solution and then presenting that to senior management to get buy-in. Also, teams need to understand what it means to use AI ethically and what does bias mitigation mean. So that is where within your operational processes, you need to have 4I checks, quality assurance, quality control checks on the ultimate decisions being made, especially where those decisions are going to impact your customer. If you are blocking transactions or you're taking a measure to restrict account usages for your customers, that's going to create friction for them. It may impact them not only personally if they're individuals, but as a business, it could impact their business. So analysts need to understand what the outcome of their decision is, but also if you're not having QA, QC, then if that decision was the wrong decision, then ultimately you're creating bias within your models. So really kind of training them about what is ethical use, what is bias mitigation, and how do you do that within your organization? And how do you keep regular touch points with your software provider to also discuss any challenges challenges or issues that you might be encountering. It's also important to have human AI collaboration, also known as like human in the loop. This is where the machine learning and the AI is not running by itself and becoming a monster of a being or a beast. It's where actually the decisions that they are then outputting to you is reviewed by a human. That is the skills you want to build, that intelligence, those analytical skills, the skills of the human looking at the decision, making the ultimate decision, and then reviewing it by an independent second party to quality assure and quality check it. It's really important, as well as a bias mitigation tool, but also it's really important to just ensure that having a human also means you can have the escalation processes. So where things need to be escalated to senior management for approval or sign off, such as if you're onboarding a politically exposed person, that is where you can assert that skill set in order to do so. And I think we're going to move on to future trends, Faisal. So yeah, I think we still have some more time left. So you're going to be best placed here as well to talk about the future trends. That is kind of from a software technology provider's perspective. But when I think about the future trends for AI and machine learning, I'm thinking about using, concepts like deep learning, reinforcement learning, which are emerging as effective tools for detecting complex anti-AML threats, but also federated learning and predictive analytics. I'm most excited about predictive analytics. This is where you're really being proactive and you're having a model be able to predict future risks, emerging risks to your business. For a financial institution, when you're kind of doing all of your kind of capital adequacy calculations, financial crime risks, and the impact that a potential fine or enforcement action will have on your business feeds into that capital adequacy number. So this is really where you can prove as a compliance function, you are adding benefits to the bottom line and you're not just a cost center. So being able to predict emerging trends, feeding your model with new emerging financial crime risk typologies so that it can then go on and detect that type of behavior within your customer base is super important. Awesome. So I think it's question and answer time now, Faisal.
We can definitely do that. One thing that sometimes comes across my mind is about future applications and potential future applications. And one of the things I'm going to tell you is that over the last sort of 5 years, the development in AI has been so rapid on the sort of non-AML space. I sort of say in the next 10 years, you're going to have high-performing financial institutions that will be running on a single compliance officer and a board member. And then the reason I say this is because you can actually, and this is not just theoretically, you can actually build an entire financial institution and business with different business logics on different AI agents that operate within each other. And really, from a regulatory point of view, what do you really need? You need a human compliance officer, you need human people that are sort of the senior management, and you don't need anything else. So as long as you have an AI agent all over your business itself that all have business logic, it'll pretty much work, which means that the type of AML solutions also has to adapt. And that's what we call, and this is not a term I invented, this is actually something that's going to be more forefront. It's called the agentic economy, basically where all economies of scale, whether that's financial, non-financial, are gonna work in the agentic manner, all by agents. And so you should expect developments in AI, AML technology that also automates and almost replaces the human AI and the human analyst part at the end of the day, and just provides only meaningful work for the compliance officer. So I can see definitely a trend towards a lot of these SaaS-driven platforms go into agentics. Hint, hint, we might be working on something similar as well. But that's sort of in future applications and future innovations. But Aspen, welcome back. Questions?
Amazing. Thank you so much, Aaliyah and Faisal. So the information you shared today is truly vital to better understanding artificial intelligence and machine learning and anti-money laundering practices. Lots of content was shared here today. So if anyone has any questions about the information shared, please go ahead and just put them in the chat below, and our panelists will try to work through all of those. It looks like we already have quite a few here, so we're going to work through them. But Faisal, this one's for you. Johar asks, how long will it take for a corporate and trust service provider to get real-time monitoring from the supervised learning?
Well, I'm going to be biased, but we do have a vertical that specializes in corporate and trust service providers. Generally, it's 3 months and 5,000 transactions. The reason is because we have data sets and models for your type of entity, your vertical itself. So that's generally the answer. If you're looking at other providers or if you've already looked at them, you should you should ask them to have sort of be okay with 5,000 transactions and 3 months of work, and that should be fine.
Amazing. Okay, next question. Maraz asks that you mentioned messy data doesn't work, but isn't it the responsibility of the data analyst to provide the clean data? And what should you do in this situation?
This feels like an operational thing. I can do the technology part, but Alia, do
Yep.
you want to take a stab at it?
Yes, certainly. So, it's a data analyst is only going to work off the data that is given to them. So I'm going to take, a really simple example of where you are, working for a bank and you are onboarding your customers, let's say automatically digitally, and you are allowing your customers to type in their name, type in their address, put in their details, and you're actually using that data to then screen your customer against. The customer could have made mistakes, there could have been human errors, misspellings involved. So that would be a great example of messy data. But if that's the data that's come through that you're screening against, there's not much the data analyst can do, unless the data analyst insists that the data we're actually going to screen against is going to be from the document, the official document that we are proving identification for, such as the passport, such as an ID card, driver's license. We're going to then lift the data from that document using OCR technology or any other technology to then screen it against. Now, that would be good data because it would be data that's coming from an official document. Similarly, as kind of, teams expand, teams scale, different payment messages are used, it really then is not a data analyst thing. It's more about the product teams, product analysts, how they're implementing different payment mechanisms, how the payment message fields are then flowing into your technology vendor that's providing you with transaction monitoring. If again, you've implemented in such a way that data is not labeled in accordance with the fields that your technology or SaaS solution is going to pick up on for customer name, currency, jurisdiction, counterparty name, counterparty bank, etc. If there's no uniformity in the way the data is labeled, you're not going to have effective screening. So the best way to manage this and mitigate this is, again, if we're thinking about it from an onboarding scenario where you are screening your customers' names to identify sanction, PEPs, or any other type of adverse information, taking the official name from a document that has already been verified as being legitimate is the best way to do it, rather than relying on a manually inputted analyst's information, because you could have customers that you are onboarding via the telephone. If I think about different types of onboarding models, there are many different ones. And then similarly for product teams, when they are implementing new products within the organization using different types of payments, they need to link in with, the technology provider, the vendor, in order to give them the heads up that, look, we're going to move into Swift payments now. What do we need to do on our end in order to ensure Swift messages are going to be screened correctly? And it kind of goes back to my point of look for a strategic partner and give them, the vision of where your business is going in the next 5 to 10 years, so they can anticipate the different types of payments you're going to be involved in, different jurisdictions, different products, your customer segments that you are going to be introducing over the next few years.
Amazing. Thank you, Aaliyah. Okay, next question. Lekrajing asks, can you please elaborate how many years of historical data is required to have a good parameterized model?
Sure. It's not a question of years, it's a question of number of transactions. The time is not a variable to consider. So the reason I can't answer this precisely is because I don't know what the context of your organization is and the kind of complexity of transactions you have. Now you might say, well, hang on a second, 5 minutes ago, you told the other guy 5,000 transactions in 3 months. That's because he's a corporate trust service provider and they have very lean and, pretty straightforward transactions for the most part, with very little complexity generally. Most of it is fairly similar from one client to another with few variations. So it doesn't require a lot of transactions to be able to come up with a reasonable certainty. In regards to your question, again, it depends on the complexity of organization, what type of customers and complex countries you work with, products you work with. So it's also not a question of years, it's a question of number of transactions.
Okay, great, thank you. An anonymous attendee asks that some countries face depreciation of their currency against the US dollar and cannot afford some AI models. Can AI models be cost effective?
Oh, no. I mean, AI models are by far, we are living in the time when AI models incredibly cheap. And I think what you meant is not making an AI model, but using it. If that's what I understand, anonymous attendee, feel free to come back and let us know. Using an AI model for your daily job is incredibly inexpensive for how much power it gives you. For those of you that use ChatGPT or other types of LLMs, it's incredible amount of power for very little amount of money that you do pay if you were sort of a premium subscriber. But you can use it for free and it's still doing a pretty good job. So AI models, for the most part, even on the AML side, are not that expensive at all. In fact, it is incredibly cheap.
Thank you. Okay, Abdullah asks, how do you see AI and ML shaping our approach to emerging risks and transaction monitoring? Additionally, would you say that the use of unsupervised learning models minimizes the risk a client may bring once onboarded by picking up anomalies in behavior that traditional methods might miss?
Yeah, I mean, what's happening now is that compliance officers have to now retrain themselves on what the different typologies they should be looking out for. Most of sort of the basic typologies, machine learning does fairly well. And so what they essentially do is that they feel braver to go into new territories and allow for new products and new customers because there's this treasure trove of unsupervised models that will essentially be able to pick up anomalies. Before, they were very hesitant on opening up new geographies, accepting new products, new customers. But now with sort of unsupervised models, that's no longer the case. Traditional methods, for the most part, were rule-based in the sense that it just worked on alerts, and you had to sort of look at it in the full context without sort of relearning it. Um, anomaly detection via unsupervised learning sort of abrogates all of that. So you don't actually look at alerts anymore. You look at it in the context of how relevant it is to your transactions.
Great, wonderful, thank you. Leah asks, what are the biggest regulatory challenges financial institutions face when implementing AI and ML for AML compliance, and how can they ensure transparency and fairness?
Yeah, I'll take this one if that's okay, Faisal.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I'd say the biggest regulatory challenge is documenting how the model actually works, especially when you're not building it in-house and you're buying it from a technology provider. The reason why it's one of the biggest challenges is we've seen regulators already come out with guidance. The Financial Action Task Force has here in the UK. We have the FCA talking about the use of machine learning and AI. Similarly, in Europe, the European Banking Association has also been talking about best practices on how to use it, but also they've actually got regulations in place for when AI and machine learning is being used for that automatic decision making, and the impact and what scenarios it can be used in and what it can't. So really, understanding from the vendor how they are maintaining their model, how they are testing it, how they are tuning it. When you think of the screening technology, what algorithms are they using? What fuzzy matching logic are they using? Things that, a compliance person might not understand. They really need to start getting familiar with this, because if you are audited, if a regulator decides to do a supervisory review on how, banks or fintechs are using AI and machine learning, they're going to be asking these questions, and they won't be asking your solutions provider. They're going to be asking you yourself. So really just having those transparent, open discussions with your software provider can really help you get it. But then also within commercial agreements, actually having, standardized terms for how often the vendor is going to be performing independent audits or internal audits on their models and the kind of algorithms they're using, how they themselves are testing and ensuring the accuracy and the effectiveness of their models. And then internally having a model governance process. So when you are adopting this type of technology, making sure you're taking it through to the right committees and the right, kind of governance that's needed in order to sign off and approve it. Because that's then how you're going to ensure that you are following up and doing your own kind of monitoring and testing, measuring KPIs off the back of it. If you're building it in-house, then of course you're going to have to do a lot of that heavy lifting yourself and have actual specialists within model risk in order to create these types of tools for you.
Great. Thank you, Aaliyah. Tamara asks, given the rise of cryptocurrency exchanges and their unique risks, how effective has AML adoption been across these platforms? Are there emerging AI or machine learning techniques tailored specifically to monitor crypto transactions more effectively than traditional methods?
Oh, off mute. Sorry about that. Absolutely. So I think the question was how AML adoption has been effective. So I don't know whether people were following CompliTech earlier this morning, but we actually had a co-webinar with a regulatory vendor that specializes in cryptocurrency-related transactions because of our integration with them. So yes, there's absolutely a lot of machine learning technologies that are used for cryptocurrency-related transactions. In fact, one of the order-dependent models that is most used for cryptocurrency on-chain monitoring is called a transformer, and as well. And so they use those type of models essentially to be able to do a lot of the clustering and the attribution detections in on-chain monitoring. So yes, there's definitely a lot of machine learning that's used for anti-money laundering in the cryptocurrency space. We ourselves work with VASPs, but we don't do on-chain monitoring. We have a partner that integrates for on-chain monitoring itself, and we do the sort of the non-crypto monitoring for them to provide the compliance officer more of a holistic view on both ends.
Great. Okay, Sanjay asks, how can AI ML driven AML monitoring systems be continuously updated to adapt to emerging typologies and evolving risks? What are the best practices for gathering client insights to refine these models regularly? And how can CompliTech support these clients on a regular basis?
Maybe Aaliyah can respond the first half and I'll take the second half.
Absolutely. So I think always keeping an eye on industry publications from different financial intelligence units, Interpol, Europol. They really have good publications out there on red flags around different types of money laundering predicate offenses. Because we have to think, it's not just the typical fraud that you're looking at. There are 22 predicate offenses that generate proceeds of crime that criminals are going to launder. Each of them have specific typologies. If you think about human trafficking, for instance, there's certain jurisdictions that are common gateways that this happens through. So feeding in those specific types of typologies that regulators have said are known typologies into your models to create rules is really useful. It's something that traditionally hasn't been done through traditional transaction monitoring because it doesn't really help you then identify anomalous behavior. So really keeping on top of what are the emerging criminal activities, how are criminals adopting the ways that they're committing their offenses, and then taking it back to how your products, how your different types of payments that your firm offer, or the different customers that you allow to bank with you, can then exploit those products and channels in order to commit offenses, and then ensuring that there are rules designed for that is the best way I think you can keep on top of evolving risks. And of course, putting through like different types of innovations like predictive analytics and emerging, for that. I personally haven't used predictive analytics, but it is something I'm excited about and would love to dive deeper in.
Yeah,
Amazing.
Going
Oh, go
off of that, the last part of the question was best practice for gathering client insights and how do we support clients on a regular basis. Really three ways to be able to do this. First, you can do regular workshops with clients and sort of ask them their questions about how they're using it, what have they seen, what is the recent fraud trend they've been observing. They are first and foremost the first victims of fraud, so they'll be able to tell you right away. So you can gather insight from that if you have regular workshops. The second is you could have client-specific false positives. So for example, if it's a client that's in the foreign exchange business, they'll have false positives that are very different than the ones that are in the insurance business. So picking up on the different specific false positives is a really great way of sort of taking that information from the clients and bettering your model. From our end, how do we support it? We have what's called event-driven reach outs. So we have a quarterly with our customers that are specifically to reach out to them, ask them about how everything was going, find out troubleshooting, get them to teach us things that we didn't know about them. Second, we reach out to them 2 months before their annual audits, make sure they have, they need the support they need because we know that it'll be helpful. So that's a good opportunity to get client insights. And then anything else which has to do with sort of the environment. So if they're going through an acquisition, merger, some other type of event that affects them and will affect the compliance department, it also is an opportunity for us to reach out to them and support them for any needs they might have.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Aaliyah and Faisal. You two have truly been incredible, and thank you for sharing your expertise and practical experiences with all of us. We're also super grateful for ComplyTech, who is the sponsor of today's webinar. If you'd like more information, please visit their website or connect with our speakers directly for further discussion. I wanted to let you all know that the recording of this webinar will be available on the GCI website and our LinkedIn page as well. All participants who attended the Zoom will receive their CPT certificates via email from GCI, so please be on the lookout for that. This will also include the link to the webinar presentation today. If anyone has any further questions about the recordings or their certificates or questions about the content delivered, please feel free to reach out to GCI at info@gci-ccm.org. Again, just thank you all so much for attending. Thank you to our panelists, and we look forward to seeing you at our future events.